All right, two factions left, and the one that we want to focus on today is Feln cards. Going to talk about those for a little bit, talk about what's good in draft, what's good in ranked, and like basically sort of how I rate them, where they go in specific decks, and all of that stuff. So those of you, pretty much everyone's seen these before. I think we've put them on the YouTubes and everything. So yeah, that's the basic idea. We're going in first with Twilight Rapture, the 2/2 for 1, or in the case of draft, the 2/2 for 2, because there's almost no way to play Twilight Rapture for 2 or for 1 on 2, which is to say, yeah, you can generally only play it on turn 2. That does not mean that it is not a very strong draft card, though. It's a really, really good aggressive unit. It works pretty well in ranked decks just because it's fast and it's nasty and it's decent at like flying, which is good for certain flying matters blue decks and for some aggro matters Feln decks. It's not an amazing card in draft, but it's still strong enough to actually make the cut, and it generally works out in most sort of draft or most ranked aggro. In draft, however, it is actually a pretty bomb card. Having a 2/2 for cheap is really, really good. You can play this card like on, you can't play this card on curve, but you can play this card in addition to other stuff on curve and really just beef your entire board. Twilight Rapture also is just like, yeah, very, very solid stat line. One of the more interesting boring units, like as a card that doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. It's really just a nice card to be having in the early game, and very solid example of a Feln 1-drop. Feln has some interesting ideas on what aggro is, and it does work out very well, but yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. Yeah, you can play 2 Twilight Raptors on turn 2, which is very exciting. Being able to play a bunch of these guys in a row is always really nice. Swiftblade, 2/3 Infiltrate, Deadly, and Quick Draw. This card is an insane draft bomb just because, well, it's not bomb, but it is nonetheless a very, very good draft card because it is something that as a 2-drop stands above all of the other 2-drops. It has that stat line that you really, really like, which is it being a 2/3. And like, yeah, that means that it's just not vulnerable to most of the good draft removal. It can block all of the good draft units, including things like the Twilight Ranger. And then if this thing gets its infiltrate off, it's just unblockable forever. Deadly and Quick Draw means that it can kill 2 different units before any other units can deal damage back, which means that you almost never want to block Swiftblade. There are situations where you could arrange 3 units with 3 attack or more in front of a Swiftblade and kill a Swiftblade that way, but that's probably one of the Swiftblade's best days ever. So this card will just consistently push damage on your opponent, and when it feels like not pushing damage anymore, it can just hang back and be a deadly blocker, meaning it trades evenly, similar to a Direfang Spider. So all of the damage whenever it's aggressive, all of the defense whenever it's defensive. It's just a really, really solid card overall in draft. In ranked, I actually think that it's got some strength, but the 2 attack means that it's a little bit low for a tempo deck, and usually you aren't going to be able to get it to live to do the defensive thing very well, so it kind of doesn't work on either side. It's just a little bit tricky, and therefore it doesn't see a lot of ranked play, but can be solid in the right type of aggro deck. Mostly I would avoid it. Grim Stranger, 2/2, when one or more strangers attack, deal that much damage to the defending player. This is my vote for like the strongest of the strangers, I think. I mean, aside from Determined Stranger, which is sort of the one that just makes all of the other strangers work all the time. Yeah, this guy is really, really good. So the attack is really important because it triggers on the turn that you play Grim Stranger, and it doesn't require Grim Stranger to attack. That's actually really flexible and just good. Like, this card is crazy solid. Yeah, you can play Raptor on turn 1 with Lumen Shepherd and a Feln banner. I think I mentioned that the last time that I did a review of this set, and it's always fun. Cute times. But yeah, in any case, Grim Stranger, this is like a card that just essentially doubles the damage, or like very effectively increases the damage of your Stranger deck to the point where it can do what it generally always wants to do, which is always attack. Grim Strangers are just really, really happy when they're attacking. There are very, very few situations where they want to sit back and be defensive, except in like a Combre Stranger type situation where you have that Empower Stranger, and you kind of want to just hold out and try and play a more defensive game. Most of the Strangers don't really support that strategy, so this card is really, really solid in draft, and it also makes Strangers valid in ranked. Like, there are ranked Stranger decks that can work with Grim Stranger. I actually saw one the other day on the Reddit. One of those ones where they were like, oh, I got top 50 master, which is meaningless, but nonetheless it does, like, it is a strong card. So like, it's fairly important that you actually get the level of you know, like this card actually does make Strangers very, very aggressive and fun. It's pretty cool stuff. Yeah, so like you can do some cool things with aggressive strangers here. You can do some cool things with like splash strangers. The other really fun thing is that the Grim Stranger's ability does in fact trigger infiltrates. So you put a Beast Caller's amulet on this guy. That's really fun. Is there any other infiltrates that you can actually do fun things with? I don't think so, but you can also get double damage off of the ability with Ferocious Stranger. You can give it lifesteal and get the lifesteal. So yeah, there's a lot of cool things that you can do with that extra damage. A lot of fun interactions, a lot of subtleties to this card. This is probably the best designed Stranger and just one of the more exciting ones. Once the set 2 comes out, we see more Strangers. This Stranger may end up making them very, very good. Haunting Scream. What's the most Grim Strangers I've ever seen in a draft deck? 1? It's a rare. It's very, very hard to see it in a draft deck, and people often don't even pick it if it is a rare, or they don't keep it if it's a rare because they don't get enough Strangers. Haunting Scream. Play a unit with cost 4 or less from the void. That may be untrue. I may have seen 2 Strangers once, and it did kill me. Okay, Haunting Scream. Play a unit with cost 4 or less from the void. It gets charge and flying. Sacrifice it at the end of turn. This card is an abject lesson in a lot of things about Eternal. It will definitely teach a lot of newbies things that will make them either love this deck or abhor it. So Haunting Scream is a definite deck archetype, and the main reason for that is Gorgon Fanatic, which is a card that when it hits its infiltrate, sacrifices itself, which means that it negates the disadvantage of Haunting Scream, gives you 3 life, and draws you 3 cards. A charge flying unit that gives you 3 life and draws you 3 cards and deals 3 damage is, yeah, something that you might actually call like an 8-cost spell. It's really, really solid. Like it's a nasty, nasty amount of stuff that is going on. And Haunting Scream also works on most of the other good infiltrate units, including Desperado, which is very strong. Feln Infiltrator, Cabal Infiltrator. Cabal Infiltrator, I think it's called. Yeah, all of the different infiltrate cards really, really like this card. There are also a couple of good 3-drops that'll like this card in other situations. Sensari Brigand's kind of fun with it, although that's a pretty tough influence requirement. Order of the Spire is extremely fun with it. I've played some dumb Order of the Spire Haunting Scream decks. That's really delightful if you want to play it. This card is a bomb in draft because it basically enables Gorgon Fanatic, and Gorgon Fanatics are fairly common uncommons. Desperado is also a fairly common uncommon, and Haunting Screaming a Desperado is a really good amount of value. Basically, Haunting Scream will make people afraid of Feln, and if you don't play around Haunting Scream, then you're making a mistake. There are a lot of decks that will clearly indicate that they have Haunting Scream, and when that happens, you need to keep your flyers back as blockers, and you need to be like really careful about what you're doing. But if you can't deal with that, then that's like, yeah, it is a thing that is just pretty tough to deal with, but eventually you'll sort of learn your way around it. It does not win all of the games. It is just a card that is very, very strong if your opponent does not pay attention to it. And in some situations, it is a card that is just a brick. The one thing that's really important to note about Haunting Scream is this is another example of Eternal and object permanence. Like, everything in Eternal keeps its abilities and stats that they gain when they are given them by cards. So giving a card charge and flying means that you can Dark Return it later and it will still have charge and flying. Sacrifice it at end of turn is an ability on the Haunting Scream and not on the unit. So if you give it charge and flying, Dark Return it, swing, and attack with it, you will not actually have to sacrifice it at end of turn unless it's a Gorgon Fanatic, in which case you killed it anyways. So yeah, a lot to break down on Haunting Scream, but an A+ card, like very, very good in draft, very, very good in ranked. I wouldn't say it's an outright bomb, but if you get the right synergies with it, it's just bananas. Feln Bloodcaster, 2/5 ultimate, pay 7 to draw a card from each player's deck. This card went from a card that was very bad to a card that defined Feln control. It used to have an ability that was something like give all units deadly for a turn, and now it has an ability that is just actually pretty demanding and wonderful. Feln Bloodcaster really just stalls the board out in a way that's pretty handy. It's good against Rakano decks, it's good against token decks. It's just very, very hard for people to deal with. It costs 3, but it's pretty meaningful. That double purple influence means it's only really playable in ranked decks that are hardcore Feln. Like, you can play it in Stone Scar Feln, or Feln Scar as they call it. It's okay, but it's pretty tough to actually get it down on 3, and that's kind of an important thing about Feln Bloodcaster. This card does push a decent amount of damage as an aggressor when you're playing a Feln deck and you're controlling your opponent, so there's a lot of love for it there. The pay 7 to draw a card from each player's deck will sometimes get you nothing, but it will always get you card advantage. So, like, this card is usually worth its salt. It's pretty hard to deal with. It actually has to be killed, and oftentimes that will take your opponent a spell that they would much rather spend on something bigger and tougher. So, Feln Bloodcaster, just a really, really solid ranked card. In draft, this card blockades the board pretty well, and I think the ultimate is fairly strong, so I think this card is quite good in draft. It doesn't do anything amazing, but that advantage does matter. It is relevant. You can also use this card in the way that you can use Pilfer, which is to say, most decks you can't use Pilfer, but you can, like with a Feln Bloodcaster. 7 is about the turn that your opponent is playing an Ikaria. Why not steal whatever they just got with Ikaria? Or something along those lines. You can get Warcries off the opponent's deck with it. You can get... you can prevent Carpet Shuffle decks from going off because they can't put stuff on top of their deck, where you can just steal it. So yeah, fun things going on with that. Very, very powerful Feln card. Feln Cauldron, not a very powerful Feln card, but kind of a fun one. This is a good example of how Eternal plays with randomness. They really like things, or the design of Eternal really likes random cards that are fun to play and not effective in like tournament settings, but actually have some really cool things going on where like just it can win or lose you the game in a really spectacular fashion. Feln Cauldron is one of the most just go deep cards that you can think of. The 1 health that it gains you is actually quite relevant. I think if it gains you 2 health, it would actually be a very powerful card. After 5 cards are discarded to Feln Cauldron. Hey, thanks for subbing, SkyCon B. I really appreciate the support, man. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so yeah, after 5 cards, you sacrifice it and you get 5 random spells. This can be anything from a bunch of protects and some secret pages. The Find the Ways will echo, so like don't worry about that. You will get 6 spells off of that. But like it can also be things like Harsh Rule, Channel the Tempest. There are actually quite a lot of big, nasty spells, and Feln Cauldron will usually pull you enough stuff to win the game. Not always, but usually. Cute thing to brew with. The main thing is that lots of people run attachment destruction in their main board, and if they do that, they're just the happiest campers to see Feln Cauldron, because Feln Cauldron specifically requires that you do its action once a turn, and on turn 4, they're pretty likely to just zap the Feln Cauldron, thus causing you to have wasted 5 cards for their 1. So, careful with that. It's not amazing. Yeah, this card is probably the worst legendary. No good in... Well, actually, no. No, it's good in draft. You can play it in draft. Totally legit. You need Echo cards with it, so get the Echo synergy, but you can do that. Like, that's totally fine. Attachment destruction might happen, in which case you're going to lose some games, but I've actually done this in draft. It was fine. It wasn't amazing, but it's certainly fun. Go ahead and do it. Gorgon Fanatic. Infiltrate. Sacrifice Gorgon Fanatic to draw 3 cards and gain 3 health. We talked about this card in the context of Haunting Scream. The card's also very good with Levitate. It's very good with other things. There's Ghost Form, Trickster's Cloak. There's a ton of cards that specifically interact with Gorgon Fanatic. There's a ton of ways to get Fanatic across, and that makes Fanatic a very, very strong card in Ranked. The thing the card is most vulnerable to is silence. If you get this card silenced, then you feel very bad because it doesn't do anything else once it's been silenced. It's kind of a boring 3-2, and it's really not very spectacular in terms of what it does. The 3 health is really relevant. That's actually a new addition to the card. It was apparently not good enough. I'm always surprised by that, but I do think that since it sacrifices some board presence, like it does actually mean that you are losing out on tempo in order to get this card out. And Feln decks are notoriously bad at killing vast swaths of the board. They have to do some interesting combos to clear out a large board. So if Fanatic gets across and you just draw a bunch of single target removal, you might still be behind in a way that's fairly meaningful. However, Fanatic is really quite special. If you are playing this card with Haunting Scream, you're playing it with Dark Returns, this card can be your kill condition, your draw spell, your damage spell, and your health gain spell all in one. And that just means that it's really just quite spectacular. There's a really good support deck around this type of card that makes it very, very good, and it's a really newbie-friendly deck to build. Like, this card is just really fun to play with. I like it in Ranked, I like it in Draft. In Draft, you want to pick up Haunting Screams and Levitates to make it work. In Ranked, the same thing applies. It's very, very good. Just really powerful effect. The body's not actually terrible, everything else about it is just pretty solid, and it forces your opponent to play around you in a way that you generally, like force them to pay attention. There's lots of ways to deal with it: silence, feeding time, anything that transforms it, anything that like unstable. It's worth unstable forming. Like there are just a lot of reasons why you don't want this card to exist. So do kill it as many different ways as you can, and never let it live for more than a turn. It's strong. All right. Hey, I said it was playable in draft, Feln Cauldron, but not necessarily good. I'm just saying that deck actually did okay, and like if you play it with a bunch of Echo cards, you can actually get some serious value out of it. Midnight Gale, 4/3 flying infiltrate. Midnight Gale gains lifesteal. So yeah, this card is quite good. It is a core archetype of the Feln aggro Feln tempo deck. A really good example, again, of how Feln does aggro and kind of does it pretty well. Like, they're not really very aggressive cards. They're not, like, super amazingly statted, but Midnight Gale, despite being both vulnerable to Torch and Vanquish, things that you really, really have to be careful of, like, is just, yeah, it's crazy nuts. Like, the lifesteal effect is really powerful. This card has to be dealt with in the air, or else it will just blow out your opponent. In draft, this card is absolutely insane. In ranked, this card is not too much different. It's just a really solid card. There are a lot of cards that will kill Midnight Gale, but you'll usually be stacking this up with a bunch of other aggro cards, and that's what makes it pretty effective. It's not a control card by any means. It's very, very bad at control, in fact, because it's probably your like least card advantage heavy card in Feln. But it is something that, despite dying to a bunch of stuff, more than pulls its weight in most fights. Yeah, we do have premium versions of lots of stuff. Let's actually go into... I have... well, anyways. I was trying to decide if I actually had to, like... Is it crafting? Yeah, crafting. There we go. Recurring Nightmare. Okay, so this card, flying, charge, infiltrate, double Recurring Nightmares, attack, and put it into your hand. Not as powerful a card as Gorgon Phonetic, but another card that can just outright destroy your opponent for basically not building his deck to defend against flyers. This card is, yeah, mean. And in a kind of like really nasty way. Like it's kind of designed to teach people a certain lesson, which is that you need to have certain cards in your deck, and those cards include some form of removal or defense against flyers. If you don't have those things, Recurring Nightmare will run roughshod over you. This card is pretty strong with a couple of different interesting tricks. There's some cool Oathbook decks with Recurring Nightmare, because anything that increases Recurring Nightmare's attack means that the double effect just happens that much faster, and you get your kill a turn earlier. So that's really cool. Yeah, this card's pretty mediocre in ranked, I would say. Like, there are certainly fun decks to build around it, and I've built all of them. Recurring Nightmare plus Rapid Shot, Recurring Nightmare plus Paladin Oathbook, Recurring Nightmare plus Righteous Fury is a really fun one. Yeah, the main thing is if it gets silenced, then that's pretty bad for you. Every time that you play it, your opponent will try to race it, so you have to basically, like, your opponent will be trying to kill you as much as possible. You'll be trying to kill them, and then if they have a torch at the one time when you're basically like trying to kill them, then yeah, that's a really big deal. Yeah, it's pretty decent against Armory. Not an amazing card, but decent enough. Like, it definitely does a bunch of damage, and Armory has 4 answers for it, all of which are torches. If you can get it back with Haunting Scream, it does come back into your hand as opposed to getting sacrificed, which is really important. It interacts with Rapid Shot the way that you would expect, doubles its power, then jumps back into your hand, and then I don't think that the temporary effect goes away. I could be wrong about that. It might have changed since the last time I saw it. But yeah, it's good interactions with a lot of spells. Plays pretty well in purple, blue, and green together, since you can Harsh Rule, Protect, and Finest Hour or Oathbook Recurring Nightmare to have some fun. In draft, this card is... I mean, in draft, this card has the same problems. It's less likely that your opponent has anything to deal with it, so you're not as likely to actually be able to... You're much more likely to get the kill with it, but you do still have to have the right type of defensive cards to keep yourself alive, as opposed to keeping Recurring Nightmare alive. If you don't have that, then don't play it in draft, but in general, this card will wreck people's draft days. So, keep that in mind. Alright. Trickster's Cloak. Trickster's Cloak. Summon the wielder is unblockable this turn, +2/+2. Card does not actually see enough play in ranked, which is to say it sees no play in ranked. It's a reasonably strong effect, and the extra health is actually meaningful. So after you get that unblockable infiltrate across, then the Trickster's Cloak will be something that has put your unit into a pretty good position in terms of like the board status and tempo. The main problem is that most people are playing infiltrate decks with Gorgon Fanatic, so Trickster's Cloak doesn't really see much play in ranked. It might see more play if we see more decks based around cards like Westwind Herald, more decks based around Desperado in particular. Like anything that plays with that can actually play Trickster's Cloak. I wouldn't recommend too many. It's not terribly strong. In draft, this card is pretty bonkers. B plus, I would say. Like, it's very, very good. It gets across a lot of damage. It buffs your unit to the point where it's pretty hard to kill. It triggers infiltrates, which is really important. And some of those infiltrates can be very, very powerful, including Argenport Ringmaster, Desperado, and Cabal Infiltrator, all of which kind of want that stat bonus. So makes things that have Infiltrate immune to Torch and then allows them to swing across for mondo amounts of damage. Very, very good. And you can just equip it as a basic weapon to get some damage across if you're trying to get into a race. So yeah, cool draft card. Cabal Spymaster, not in draft. It is a Jex Bounty card, I think. It could actually be Avara's favorite card. I could be wrong about that, but no, yeah, it's Jex Bounty. So units can infiltrate any number of times. This card has interesting strengths. The current infiltrate decks are really happy with Gorgon Fanatic, so Cabal Spymaster doesn't do a lot. One of the things that's interesting about this card is that when you play Cabal Spymaster, the way that it works is it refreshes all of your infiltrates, so even if Cabal Spymaster dies, your units can still infiltrate at least a second time. That's really relevant and quite meaningful. Like, it is something that like really buffs up cards like Direwood Beastcaller, which has one of the strongest infiltrates in the game, or Argenport Ringmaster or Westwind Herald. In particular, this card actually has an infinite combo with Westwind Herald, which I think we've talked about several times, where Spymaster plus Westwind Herald plus Cauldron Channeler and Mirror Image. Just infinite damage, tons of fun. In addition, this card is pretty hard to kill. A 4/4 is immune to Torch. It is hybrid, so it's immune to Annihilate. It can't die to Suffocate. It can die to Vanquish, but like that's you know, a pretty decent setup for a 4-cost 4/4. This card is actually pretty solid just in terms of stat line. Like, that is a kind of stat line that you're pretty okay with on a 4-cost card. Navani and Spymaster both have similar like levels of just mostly invulnerability. They aren't very good at attacking in, but they're very good at staying alive while they get their effects off. So yeah, Spymaster's pretty cool. Feeding time. Transform a unit into a pig, then kill it. This effect is not a double effect, so it does not pop Aegises and then kill the unit. It will just do its thing. That's an important thing to recognize about most cards. No card with a double effect will do anything that pops an Aegis and then does the effect. So keep that in mind. But okay, so most things going on here. Let's see here. This card is the final solution to a lot of big problems. Anything that has Void Recursion, anything that has a big threat when it comes back from the Void with like Dark Return. So Gorgon Fanatic is probably the biggest answer. Basically, this card just kills something and means that it's totally dead. It's a fun Surso reference, good little card that like sort of references that card in particular. And yeah, it's very, very solid as a removal spell. I highly recommend it in some hybrid decks. One of the things that's nice about it is that it is not double shadow, so it can be an alternative to Deathstrike in several instances. This card is sometimes not as good as Deathstrike, and sometimes is. It's pretty dependent on the meta, but it's very good for killing Dawnwalkers, good for killing Gorgon Fanatics, good for killing anything in a Shadow deck so that it doesn't come back with Dark Return. It just murders a lot of things and basically transforms a lot of your worst nightmares into things that are relatively harmless. You can sometimes get killed by pigs. That's a little bit unpleasant, but it takes a lot of work on your opponent's part, and if they're trying to kill you with pigs, that means they have very, very few other options. Feeding time is mostly just very solid, and yeah, I think it's a really solid just piece of equipment, or really solid spell piece of equipment because it's an axe. See, yeah. Anyways, this card is super strong in draft because it is just a unconditional removal spell at 4. That's very, very important. Also, there are a lot of good entomb effects in draft, so worth it to kill some of those things as well. And in ranked, it's very similar. Doesn't see a ton of play because it's pretty expensive, but it sees about the same amount of play as Death Strike. In Feln, anyways. Alright. Champion of Cunning. Flying and Aegis at the end of your turn. Oh, did I say like? Sorry guys, I did mean to say like final answer. I probably just that's not appropriate. You're right. Try to cut it out of the YouTube video. I don't know if it'll be possible, but I'll take a look at it. Anyways, Champion of Cunning, quintuple Primal, Flying and Aegis, and quintuple Shadow at the end of your turn. Give your units +2 strength. So this card is okay, Brain. Yeah, this used to be the best card in Eternal. Just was terrifying. I'm not going to talk about the old version of Champion of Cunning because it was just awful. But the new design is actually something I really, really like. So this card is pretty bananas. It's one of the strongest champions in the game. Let's see here. This one ranks up with Champion of Glory, which sees way too much play in Rakano, so is probably the strongest champion. Champion of Chaos, which has been recently nerfed, and I think it's probably second of the champions. Champion of Wisdom and Champion of Chaos are both very comparable, but Champion of Cunning is just a really, really strong Feln card for a lot of different reasons. For one, it's a card that demands answers and has Flying and Aegis, which means that it's not very easy to get answers, so it's fairly hard to remove from the board. And it does take like 2 spells to remove it from the board, which means that it tends to get a lot of value out of that aspect. It's also pretty good even if it just sticks on the board for 1 turn, because that triple Primal influence or triple Shadow influence gives a very, very powerful effect. A 7/5 Champion of Cunning is pretty scary, but 4/2 Feln Strangers, 4/5 Feln Bloodcasters, 5/5 Black Sky Harbingers. There are a lot of things in Feln that are just made so much more powerful by +2 attack, and yeah, Champion of Cunning just makes a really relevant buff happen. This card will win stalemates very, very quickly, and like within 3 or 4 turns, you will have lethal damage in some form or another. It's pretty hard to not stick this and win if you stick it with all of the different influence. There are ways to lose with this card, but yeah, it interacts very well with Vara, interacts very well with Recursion, and interacts very well with all of the other units that you're playing in Feln Control. So it turns your control deck into an aggro deck and provides you with a really cool finisher. Nice stuff. Fun, fun times. Alright, so... oh, there's the premium version with the shiny sword. Spell Swipe. Negate an enemy spell, then draw it. So this steals the opponent's spell. That does negate influence requirements, as with all steal effects. Very, very important to note. Feln Bloodcaster, by the way, also does that. So this is hard to play in draft. I would say actually like really hard to play in draft, but it's kind of nice if you can get it off because it is just a pretty good value. I would say that it's probably not an amazing card to be running in draft, but if you have the right type of deck, then go for it. Basically, just think about whether or not you're ever going to be in situations where you have 5 power open and you're playing pretty passively. So if you have a lot of cards like Feln Bloodcaster, if you have a lot of cards that are defensive and you're like looking for a big finisher, Spell Swipe might actually be okay. But in ranked, it's the same situation. You have to have 5 power open, which means you have to be playing somewhat inefficiently, but if you have enough cards like Wisdom of the Elders and just anything that draws cards and or anything that does something at the end of turn, Spell Swipe can be pretty cool to hold onto in addition to those cards. So it can be good in certain big Feln decks and some other big decks that splash Feln. Not easy to play, fairly difficult, I would say. The advantage is totally worth it. The negation is very strong, but you have to get it off, and that's tricky. Very hard. I love this card, actually. It's really, really fun, but I would not say that it's amazing, and you have to be pretty careful about it. Might be better in set 2. There's probably going to be some options to make this spell cheaper or more interesting. We will see. There's also probably going to be more big spells. The spell was better when there were like 10 cost fast spells around, so might be something worth considering later. Alright, Withering Witch. 1/1, summon each enemy unit's health becomes 1. This used to be a 1/4. It was pretty good then. It's still pretty good now. Actually, altering the stat line has not affected it very much at all. So this does a couple of really interesting things, and we're going to actually talk about the interactions because I'm pretty sure that I've failed to talk about the interactions several times in a row, and I'm pretty awful at doing it myself in tournaments, so I often don't explain it. But basically, the way that Withering Witch works is that when you make every enemy unit's health become 1, because this is an enemy effect, it works in your... because this is your effect, it works in your favor. With most things that drop your opponent's health, or with most things where your opponent's health drops as a result of, like, say, a Finest Hour, or, like, if it had health and then it suddenly doesn't, typically the unit does not die. With Withering Witch, if the unit has damage on it and you Withering Witch it, it dies. So you can Vara's Favor something, play a Withering Witch, and then it will die, because it has 1 damage on it and its health is 1. It also works with Lightning Storm, which makes Lightning Storm Withering Witch the very common Feln combo that you use to clear out boards that are too big of a threat. Feln is notoriously bad at dealing with large groups of units, so that's a really, really strong combo, and Withering Witch already sort of deals with large groups of units in a pretty effective way. This card combos very well with the next card on the list, which is Black Sky Harbinger, so that's really worth it. Like, it's a good combo card to have. I think this card is a 2 of splash in most Feln control, and sometimes even more than that. It does have some pretty powerful effects. And yeah, cool card. Lots of fun interactions. The other one that's really important is if you Withering Witch a bunch of units and you decay a Xenon Obelisk, all of the units die. So, cute times. Alright, Black Sky Harbinger. Flying, lifesteal, summon, deal 1 damage to each enemy. Of course, if you Withering Witch to your opponent, that's not a bad deal. Black Sky Harbinger is an intensely strong 6-drop. Absolute bomb in both draft and ranked. It doesn't win games on its own typically, but it will unlose them, I guess is the most appropriate way to say that. Like, if you're playing a slow Feln control deck, then what you're typically doing is you're just keeping your opponent's stuff as minimal as possible, and basically, like, when you're just in a damage race, Black Sky Harbinger is usually going to win. This card gets a ton of health gain, and then it gets even more health gain every time it attacks, which means it has to be dealt with. It's pretty hard to deal with. That stat line's very effective. 3/5 means that it's just not vulnerable to a lot of stuff. And it is hybrid, of course, which is always good for your survivability. Yeah, I think this card is just crazy solid. It kills token deck strategies very dead. It works well with Withering Witch. It usually picks up at least 1 unit on the turn that it comes down, which is always at least 1 for 1 card value, or 2 for 1 card value. And yeah, it's reasonably strong in a lot of different situations. So yeah, this card is nuts. Pick it and draft if you can. It is a legendary, but hard to do. Nightmaw Sight Unseen. 7/7, your units are unblockable. There are problems with this card relating to what you can do with the card, like just being a 7-cost card. The effect is intensely powerful. It's really good, and this card can see a lot of play in Feln decks. The main issue is that it's doing a lot of the same things that Champion of Cunning is doing, which is to say making all of your units into very scary threats. Nightmaw does it in a slightly different way, which forces your units to attack in as opposed to being defensive until they can kill your opponent. So that's a little bit risky. It also doesn't have Aegis, which means that it, has that kind of issue. It is a capable beater all on its own. It is an absolute draft bomb because a 7/7 unblockable is just the worst thing that you can think of. And yeah, like, it makes all your other units unblockable. Go it. It's really quite solid. I think the card just is a little bit awkward in ranked due to the overall power curve, but I like it anyways. I think it's pretty strong, and I think you can play it if you get a couple of copies of it. Yeah, definitely fits more in like a Feln mid-range archetype. So look for this card in set 2, because there's a good chance that archetype might be even more supported than it is now. And I think that's potentially a pretty strong option. So we'll see. Snowcrush Animist. Deadly, summon, kill all enemy units with 3 power or less, 3 strength or less, man. Stun all other enemy units. So absolutely bananas summon effect. and the primary thing that you often do with Snowcrush Animist is discard it to some effect like Sporefolk or Herald Song, and then Grasping in Shadows at Shadows for 5 to Snowcrush Animist and kill a bunch of stuff. This card definitely just completely wipes your opponent's board in a really effective fashion. The only thing it doesn't kill is Sandstorm Titan, and then Snowcrush Animist can block Sandstorm Titan and kill it, so yeah, fun times. This is a really powerful effect. It's costed appropriately, so it doesn't see as much play just because it costs 8, but works very well with Vara decks in particular. Is very good the more that you can recur it, because every time that you do this, you just put your opponent's entire strategy on hold for 2 turns. And that's good to do, and very effective at just like wiping out token decks and doing crazy things. Like Black Sky Harbinger or like Nightmaw, Snowcrush Animist basically just suffers from the fact that it is a more expensive thing that does a lot of the things that other things in Feln are doing. Black Sky Harbinger and Champion of Cunning has similar effects that are a little bit less powerful, but often are a little bit more effective because they come out earlier. Snowcrush Animist is nonetheless really solid. I like this card a lot. The Deadly actually is quite relevant. There's some cool Deadly Rod decks that will do this. Divining Rod. If you can actually get Snowcrush Animist off a Divining Rod, that's a crazy effect. One of my biggest, like, there's a YouTube video when Champion of Cunning gave charge where I put a Divining Rod on it. It's like the first thing in Eternal Highlights, and it's really fun, where I just like Divining Rod, discard like Vara's and other, or like play out Vara's, discard Champion of Cunning's. Vara brings back the Champion of Cunning's, hit Snowcrush Animist as well, kill all enemy units, all of the stuff has charge, Vara has like all of that stuff. Yeah, no, it's a crazy deck. It's really great. This card is really bananas in draft. Like, you have to get to 8, but that's actually quite possible if you're playing a slow Feln deck. And if you are playing a slow Feln deck, this card will just end the game in draft. And in ranked, it's got a similar effect. It's very good at just like making your opponent surrender. So super powerful, little bit expensive, sometimes doesn't win the game, similar to most other Feln cards. So ranks up pretty well with this. All right, that's it for that one. To the YouTube people, thanks so much for watching. And to the Twitch people, let's get back to drafting perhaps, or we could keep talking about stuff.